So earlier in the year, both myself and Triv of Trivial Theatre took part in a live stream event as part of Streamers Streaming for Charity. A great bunch doing some fantastic work for some very good causes. We streamed What the Dub for just over 2.5 hours, and people could donate money while we streamed, and to make things interesting, depending on the amount you donated, we'd do various challenges. For Triv, it was every time someone donated a certain amount, she'd have to take a Black Death candy, one of the sourest sweets ever released. The thing contained a genuine health warning that consuming more than 2 in a short period of time could cause chemical burns and upset the stomach. They weren't suitable for children under 8, and to be fair to her, she may have completely destroyed her stomach lining and mouth, but she did it like a champ and we were very, very proud. I, on the other hand, went for the old classic, doing shots. And I have to say, you guys were very generous with your donations. Very generous. If I didn't know any better, I'd swear you guys were trying to kill me. Still, it was a hell of a fun night for all involved, and the border alcohol poisoning and acid burns were absolutely worth it for the cause. And we thank each and every one of you who joined us that night and went above and beyond with your donations. You guys are honestly amazing. But there was one additional perk we put in place for the person who donated the largest amount of money during our stream. On top of making them honorary king or queen of the stream, the person who donated the most money during the stream would get something rather special. A personalised review, just for them on any film they wanted from yours truly. It could be a mainstream classic, it could be a bottom-of-the-barrel schlock piece. The winner could have had me watching Too Small to Take It All 6 and I'd have obliged. It'd be theirs and only theirs to do what they wanted with it, for their eyes only. And, on the night, it was John Cleveland who absolutely blew both me and Triv away with his total kindness and generosity, kicking the stream off with a hell of a bang right out of the gate. John, I want to personally thank you for your beyond kind donation, and for your absolute awesomeness both on the stream and on our Discord page. You're an absolute wealth of cult movie knowledge, and you seem like a really awesome guy. So thank you so much for all that you've done.
When I signed up for the charity event, I really had no idea of what kind of result we'd have. As is always the case, you never know until you hit the end stream button how much was raised on your watch. All you can really do is hope the combination of entertainment and generous hearts line up to do something great. What we got was beyond anything I could have imagined. Dan's liver and desk, as well as my mouth and stomach, will probably never be the same. But it was worth it on so many levels, and in ways I didn't expect. All the folks that donated, and in the amounts that were donated, still gets me kind of emotional. We raised €500 over the goal during the course of the charity event, thanks to all of you. And with one very special thanks to John. Man, your generosity was above and beyond anything we could have anticipated, and there's no way I can ever properly say thank you. So I'm gonna leave it at this. You made such a difference, and Dan and I thank you from the bottom of our collective hearts. So, cheers to you.
I reached out to John shortly after leaving the hospital and asked what movie he'd like me to review and how he'd like me to send him the finished video. And to his absolute credit and further proving what an absolute top gent he is, he told me that he didn't want to keep the video as just a private thing for him. He wanted you guys to see it too. So, here it is. Now you may be wondering what film John chose for me to review. He has a very thorough knowledge of this kind of thing, so I was genuinely expecting everything and anything to be suggested. But he chose a movie that has a personal connection to him. A film that he described himself as being the go-to movie to recommend to people when they want to see what he considers to be a 5 out of 5 level bad movie. He summed it up pretty much as it having a vibe of its own, and that movie is 1998's Die Hard Dracula. A film that I'd never heard of, but the title absolutely caught my interest, and after catching a trailer for it online, I just had to nab a proper DVD copy of this thing and check it out. And you know you're going to be in for a good time when the film arrives as an old-style, extra-rigid DVD case, and the DVD is in fact a DVD-R that's been hand-burned with a printer paper label. This is the official release, apparently, and I'm getting palpitations already. The film opens with a brief history of Vlad the Impaler, They explain what a ruthless killer he was and that when he died, they put him in a casket and left him in the basement of a castle to rot. However, it's been alleged that Vlad lives on as a certain Count Dracula, who's been stalking a neighbouring village for virgins and sustenance for centuries. We then jump forward in time 300 years and a priest in the village is praying for the curse that's plagued his village for all this time to be lifted. Whether it's coincidental or if Dracula's just fed up with all of these priests giving him grief over the years is unclear. But in either case, Vlad makes his coffin rise out of the basement of the castle and out into the open looking for another castle to set up shop. Confusingly, the film then decides to show the next scene with a sepia filter on it, implying it's a flashback. But we've already jumped 300 years into the future only a few moments ago. So, either the scene was a flashback to an event 300 years ago, in which case why flash forward to flash back to flash forward, or the jump in time caption was a late addition to the edit and they couldn't unsepia the footage. Anyway, the scene itself basically follows Sonia, a young girl from the nearest village who's caught the eye of the area's king. He wants her as a queen, and he's intent on doing anything he can to make that the case. There's an extended chase sequence leading up to the castle Dracula's just flown into and what's implied to be a rape scene, but no clothes come off, and in all the ruckus they summon Meatloaf? Oh wait, no, it's just fat porridge-faced Dracula, who basically kills the king pretty effortlessly and then turns Sonia into his bride for life. We then cut to America, as we're introduced to Brad, Steven and Julia. Steven and Julia are pretty much in a thing in as much as a thing that isn't officially a thing can be called a thing, and Brad's third wheeling it because they're out on the lake riding speedboats at high speed and water skiing. But disaster strikes when Julia decides to give the skiing a try and she refuses to try a life jacket on because she's hardcore. And after a few laps of the lake, Steven and Brad turn round to find that Julia is gone and nowhere to be found. We then immediately cut to later that night and basically Julia's dead apparently. Steven's taken it pretty badly, but his dad tries to reassure him a bit. The pair look up and see a shooting star. Steven makes a wish on it that a certain drowned girl will come back. We then cut to a funeral taking place in the Eastern European village that Dracula moved to at the start of the movie. This scene, for some reason, is played for laughs, and a short time after the service gets underway, a comet crashes out of the sky, hits the coffin, and the woman inside suddenly springs back to life and is very confused. Meanwhile, a couple of days pass and Steven decides that he needs to get out and travel a bit to process the loss of Julia. So, he books himself a vacation to Europe. Moravia to be precise, but before he leaves to catch his flight, his mother stops him at the door to give him a protective amulet that's supposed to ward off evil spirits in that area. A very weird and oddly specific parting gift given the circumstances, but hey ho. Anyway, extended plane sequence, extended driving sequence, extended travelling around the sights and sounds of a small Eastern European city sequence, and eventually Steven makes it back to his hotel, where he promptly gets changed into a nice suit and leaves to go out for a night of drinking. He overdoes it while the memories of Julia wash over him and he winds up screaming at a church before passing out. The next day, Steven's out and about again. He rents a car and begins heading towards Moravia. Only, along the way he gets into the most casual car accident that I've ever seen committed to the medium of cinema, where he ends up off-road crashed into a woodland. He gets out of the car, puts a bandage on his head and bumbles about in the woods a bit like a right wally until he arrives in the small village of Dubova. He heads into an inn and tries to explain his circumstances, but the patrons of the place just laugh and take the piss out of him. That's when he's inadvertently introduced to Carla, the woman we saw resurrected at the funeral earlier. Her resemblance to Julia startles Steven, who promptly passes out again. The next day, it's revealed that Carla put Steven to bed in one of the inn's bedrooms, and after a somewhat questionable coma kiss, Steven wakes up and the pair start swapping info. It's revealed that exactly 35 days ago to the day, both Julia and Carla drowned under unfortunate circumstances, that being drowning. But when Steven wished on that falling star for a drowned girl to come back, he didn't specify which drowned girl. So Carla got magically resurrected instead. As such, she's trying to figure out what to do now that she's not dead, and a lot of the village are terrified of her, claiming that she's cursed. The pair also tell each other that they're recently single, and with that, they're basically dating. While this is going on, one of the local girls heads out to a nearby river and ends up meeting ZZ Top Dracula, who hypnotises her, takes control, and goes in for a bite. Stephen, meanwhile, gets chatting to the locals of the inn and quickly finds out about a series of disappearances that have been happening in the village that are all tied to a legend about a monster who lives in a nearby castle. It's at this point that news of the local girl's disappearance reaches the inn, and a priest decides that enough is enough and that they're going to call in an expert. But not just any expert though, Van Helsing. And when we say Van Helsing here, we're not talking Peter Cushing or Hugh Jackman or, well, anyone with a stoic and dour heroic appearance. We're talking about a goofy little guy who's going to bumble about for the next 50 plus minutes, talk like a Midwesterner, and repeatedly break into Dracula's castle to try and kill him, only to end up either being punted out or just flat out leaving when the plan didn't work, with an air of, oh well, see you in an hour when I try again, I guess. We cool? Okay? Cool. I'm not kidding, that is basically the rest of the movie, more or less. Van Helsing and Stephen sort of form a soft alliance to try and take down Dracula. Dracula kind of mellows out a bit and just starts doing his thing without much issue, and every 5 to 10 minutes or so, Van Helsing and Stephen will storm Dracula's castle, fail, and retreat back to the bar to idly chat and think about the next attempt. Oh, and Carla and Stephen's relationship? Well, it doesn't so much grow, more explodes in bursts. Like, I don't want to get too spoiler heavy, but the guy's been in the village for less than 4 days and the pair basically end up agreeing to marry each other. Yeesh. In a high-stakes movie of a tale as old as time, will Van Helsing once again defeat Dracula? Will Dracula claim another bride for his harem? And just how long has Stephen been backpacking for? It seems like the whole film happens in like 6 days, but it's got to be longer than that. I don't know. All I do know is you'll believe a casket can fly if you have the time and can find out a copy of Die Hard Dracula. And I feel quite confident in saying that Die Hard Dracula absolutely has a tonal feel and vibe to it that you'll almost certainly never have experienced before. It doesn't feel like a real movie. It feels like the kind of crossing point between some of the lower end offerings of the SOV genre, a softcore flick, and one of those faux movies that play on TV in the background of real movies. It doesn't quite feel like it should exist, and yet, here we are. For starters, the script's an absolute train wreck of a thing, bearing in mind that this is most generously pitched as a horror comedy and could more reasonably be described as a horror film that periodically forgets it's a horror film and has moments that are so unintentionally cringy and embarrassing to all involved that it's funny. I'm not saying that this doesn't have intentional comedy moments in it. I'm fairly confident that the filmmaker wasn't aiming to make a straight horror here. But the thing is, with something like horror comedy, you really have to commit to the comedy element if this thing's gonna work. You can put 1 or 2 comedy moments in a straight horror film and that's fine. Or you can go the whole hog or just make it an out-and-out horror comedy with emphasis on the comedy. But here, it feels like the director or writer had commitment issues, because we get enough gags to make you think it's a horror comedy, but not enough to cement that opinion. As such, it kind of stutters its way across the runtime, giving an unsure feeling and tone as to exactly what it wants to be. The pacing is terrible, quite frankly. It doesn't really keep a pace. Things change on a scene-by-scene basis, with some sequences running way too long for what was required to put the message across, and other scenes that really would have helped add some context and beef things up a bit barely get a couple of sentences before we're forced to move on. There's a clear, if not slightly clunky, transition between the first and second acts, but once Van Helsing enters the picture, the film basically gets locked in one of the weirdest scripted loops I think I've ever seen. So picture the scene, right? You're making a Dracula movie. You have Dracula and Van Helsing, 2 legendary characters of fiction that we've seen duke it out over literal decades, if not centuries at this point. In almost all of their portrayals, given they're supposed to be fairly clean hero and villain archetypes, you'd expect a quite strong contrast between the 2 characters, right? Maybe some aggression towards each other, maybe some savage action of the 2 battling for life and undeath. Well, Die Hard Dracula's approach to the Van Helsing Dracula Battle for the Ages is to basically give them all the tooth and venom of a couple of firmly polite elderly neighbours arguing over what day to put the trash out. Quite literally, once Van Helsing and Dracula are established in this film, sometime around the middle of the second act, we get locked in a loop where Van Helsing and Stephen will frustratingly discuss taking out Dracula to save the village, then it will cut to them heading over to Dracula's castle. Quite often they'll just walk straight into the place. Dracula will be hanging about and will greet them quite politely. Van Helsing will, softly compliment Dracula on his decor choices before hurling some pocket sand at Dracula, only for it not to work. Dracula will then kind of sigh and be like, well, see you again in a bit. At which point Van Helsing will then politely excuse himself, as will Stephen, and the pair will run away back to the inn to frustratingly talk about how to get rid of Dracula again. As a bit of a bonus, occasionally Dracula will get fed up of this shit and will either use a weapon or magic thingy that Van Helsing has tried to use on him back at Van Helsing. Or, while Helsing and Stephen are trying to leave the castle, Dracula will either start throwing magic at them or, somewhat aggravated, will do something like cut their rope that they used to climb into the castle so they fall into the lakes below. It's the most half-hearted attempt at taking out a vampire that I've ever seen, and the one or two times they nearly do kill him, it's totally by accident, and Dracula's response is about as surprised that they nearly pulled it off as it is for the audience that they nearly pulled it off. I think your mileage will vary on the third act depending on how well you get on with the concept of someone repeating something over and over to the point that it starts getting funnier and funnier. I sometimes call it the Stuart Lee effect, named after a UK comedian. By even adding just a little bit of emphasis to particular words in a gag over time, he could turn something that would otherwise be dull and annoying into something truly hilarious. I think if you get on with that as a concept, then the third act of this thing will have you in stitches. If you don't, I think you'll actively treat this thing with contempt. That being said, the first two acts don't fare particularly well either. The first act is probably the film's strongest one, but it's a bit lumpy all things considered. They do manage to establish and hit all the key beats they need in order to set up the second and third acts, but there's a lot of moments that feel like they're just there to pad the runtime. The extended sequence of Stephen's mum giving him a protective charm, and the ultra-extended intro and travel sequences, for example. The pacing of these establishing scenes too are a little bit all over the place, which does throw things out a bit in terms of trying to keep a consistent rhythm and pacing to the narrative structures. The second act is where things really start to leave the road and head over the security railings, as that uneven pacing somehow spirals out into an even more inconsistent fudge of half-thoughts and unclear ideas. And we find ourselves in a place where it really feels like the director's spinning way too many plates. You have Van Helsing and Stephen's plot, you have Stephen and Carla's plot lines, Dracula's thing that isn't really explained, the people of the inn, etc. And that's not to mention the plot elements that just go dead after the first act. Like, why give Stephen's parents a decent chunk of the first act if they never come back after that and don't really add anything to the plot? Why introduce Stephen's friend Brad if they're just going to airlock him after the speedboat scenes? They repeatedly draw attention to the fact that Carla and Julia look alike, the implication being that this might lead somewhere, but no, it's just mentioned because, apparently. That's another point actually, the stakes for the movie are unclear and it really throws Dracula's purpose in this out of whack. Generally speaking, the point of having an antagonist in your movie is to give them a purpose that negatively affects the protagonist, leading to conflict and some kind of resolution. There aren't really any stakes in Die Hard Dracula. Dracula isn't acting with any malice intent really at this point. He's just a guy who needs blood to live and is looking to mind control and bang 20 to 30-year-olds. I mean, mild spoilers here, but he eventually does go for Carla, but that's only in the final 15 minutes of the movie, and I don't believe it was intentionally as an act of malice to Stephen. Guy just liked the look of her and wanted blood. Because the film doesn't really offer anything resembling a high-stakes situation for Dracula, the highest things get danger-wise is, I've just kidnapped your fiancée who only became your fiancée a day or so ago and who you've only known for about 4 days collectively. It means that for most of the runtime I was sat there thinking, I feel they've overstated just how dangerous this immortal bloodsucker really is, honestly. I mean, they allude to several disappearances in the village in recent weeks and months, but they never clarify exactly how many disappearances there've been, and none of them can conclusively prove the disappearances were solely by the hands of Dracula. Nor do they show any other victims of Dracula, barring his 2 brides and a horny king in a sepia sequence. I can honestly say that I've never seen a Dracula film be so chill and hands-off about its threat. Like, in places, it feels like had Dracula succeeded in whatever he was doing and only a couple of villagers survived, the saddest or angriest that things would get is an apathetic shrug and a, well, it's not the end of the world. And that's a terrible tone to establish with your monster movie. That's not to mention the dialogue, which consistently straddles the line between meandering, aimless and overly conversational, and melodramatic over-the-topness that mixes about as well with the aimless dialogue as lemon juice to milk. I'm not kidding when I say that 75% of this thing is just guys sat round a table, Reservoir Dogs style, but without the naturalism, just talking absolute bollocks about the past, the village's history, Dracula or Van Helsing's history, or even just about the day-to-day runnings of the village. It's all done with a very pleasant, upbeat tone that feels wildly out of beat with the actual events unfolding in the film. Then 25% of the time it's like they remember that this is supposed to be a big dramatic Dracula movie, and we suddenly get Brian Blessed from Flash Gordon style bombasticity. I feel it's another instance where your tolerance for long-winded, bizarrely toned dialogue will decide whether you get on with this thing or not. But for me, I'm still on the fence. But I'm leaning towards kinda liking it. It's dull, but when it does hit the right tone infrequently, it really scratches an itch. The script was written and directed by Peter Horrock. This is his only writing or directing credit. He seems to be a stuntman professionally. In that regard, he has 25 credits, with titles including Mystery Men and The Nutty Professor. And that's all I can find about him online. He seems like a rather private person, honestly. Probably because he made Die Hard Dracula. What absolutely threw me with this thing was just how all over the place the direction really was. I deal with a lot of first-time directors as a result of this channel, so I'm used to things being a bit unpredictable in terms of style, technical skill, and what an effective end product should look like. But Die Hard Dracula is so strange stylistically, because it doesn't even feel like it had just one director attached to it. This thing runs the gauntlet, delivering a spectrum of ability that ranges from genuinely impressive and filmic looking scenes that wouldn't have felt out of place actually being shot on film. The introduction is the first thing that springs to mind there, though that may be stock footage, so yeah. Right the way through to scenes that would make even the most incompetent SOV filmmaker go, that's a bit shit looking, mate. And it jumps so aggressively between these styles that the end result is just a hideously jarring watch that honestly made me wonder how a director could produce such solid stylized imagery while simultaneously coming across in parts like he didn't know which end of the camera was the bit you needed to point at the thing you wanted to film. It's totally inconsistent stylistically across the runtime. They use things like sepia filters, generally reserved for showing things that happened in the past, for stuff that's apparently happening in the present. They're inconsistent with the lighting setups, meaning we get several styles literally across a shot-by-shot basis, let alone a scene-by-scene one. The continuity's pretty fucked as well. Dracula changes makeup drastically in pretty much every scene of this thing, which is beyond confusing. This isn't so much filmmaking without a clear vision, more it's filmmaking where it feels like the director just left the cast and crew to do whatever they thought would work unquestioningly. This extends to the cast direction, where it feels, for the most part, like Peter just told the cast where the camera lens was going to be and told them to aim towards that. Everyone has an awkward stiffness about them throughout. The lines don't have much of any kind of passion behind them. Everything just comes across as ultra chummy for the most part. Basically just like friends politely making idle chatter. Which is great if you're writing a slice of life drama or some kind of Woody Allen type Manhattan project, but it's awful for this kind of horror movie and leaves us with end results that are essentially a production asleep at the wheel and smashing into the barriers repeatedly. The Cine's largely atrocious as well, while it absolutely has its own stylised moments. Again, that intro sequence where they run through the history of Vlad the Impaler is very well handled. Moments like that are very few and far between, and for the most part we find ourselves in a position that's somewhere between lower-end SOV and 90s softcore. There's something unmistakably porny about this film that I can't quite put my finger on, just something in the look, style and tone of the thing that keeps connecting this in my mind to productions like Emmanuel 2000, Platinum Blonde or The Sex Files. Indeed, the back of the box actually has a big warning that the film contains nudity. Nudity, I might add, that doesn't happen until 10 minutes off the end of the film and is literally one shot of boobs followed a bit later by one nude shot where the nude person is in fact almost completely covered tastefully. Meaning that while they're nude, they're not really nude. Beyond the tone of this thing, it's about what you'd expect. Shots aren't particularly well composed, barring the odd exception. I don't believe any kind of blocking took place on this production. There's little to no B-roll shot, so everything's pretty much shot for function rather than any kind of creative zeal. Sequences are poorly constructed, lack fluidity, largely feel lumpy and uneven, and broadly speaking, are pretty dire. The CG elements here are absolutely atrocious. There are moments here where it's quite literally just a still image superimposed over moving footage. This is the kind of stuff YouTubers were doing in 2004 unconvincingly, so while it was absolutely dire to see it here in a 1998 film, I actually kind of had a little bit of nostalgia for all the corniness of it. They don't utilise lighting or colour effectively at all, everything's slightly overdark and lacking any kind of real impact. Use of blue is probably the closest you'll get to a stylisation choice here, and even then that's slapdash. The whole thing feels very ramshackled and thrown together. It doesn't feel like this was a very well planned production at all, it was more of a, I have an idea in my head and I've shot the idea, why isn't it working in the edit? Performance-wise, it's hilarious. Ernest M. Garcia as Dracula is under 40 pounds of latex and makeup through this role and has pretty much entirely been ADR'd for the whole movie. As such, he can't really emote in any way that would show up past the makeup, and all his dialogue's been completely wrecked as a result of being fully removed from the scenario he's dubbing for. As such, for most of the film, it looks like he's wearing a Halloween mask and it sounds like he's got 5 minutes left of his paid time and is waiting to be able to go home. He's way too dry and unanimated, and the fact that, as I mentioned, the angriest he gets is just slightly irate, makes his performance as Dracula arguably one of the most bizarre in the entire film. As a close second, Bruce Glover as Van Helsing is just way too chummy. He comes across as a mix of Richard Attenborough's John Hammond from Jurassic Park and Major General Stanley from the Pirates of Penzance. A smidge doddery, chatty and occasionally thoughtful, he'd be a fantastic foil in a doddery professor role, but as a vampire hunter extraordinaire, he just didn't fit the bill for me. I feel there should be an air of troubled to any Van Helsing performance, and that doesn't strictly mean a coldness, but just a layer to the performance that implies that he's seen some shit. And here, Glover doesn't give that. He gives off the vibe of a guy who, at the drop of a hat, could produce a lively slideshow presentation of his holiday to Aruba in 1954. He's perfectly animate and naturalistic. It's not a bad performance. It's just not a very good Van Helsing. As for Danny Sation as Stephen, he gave me Garth Marenghi's Dark Place vibes. He's awkward, stiff, didn't deliver one line convincingly, he seemed to struggle with physical animation, and while I can't dunk on him too hard because this was his first time on camera, I'd like to see anyone who can stroll onto a film set and just be good with no prior experience, he wasn't a particularly confident leading man and didn't capture the vibe that this thing really needed. The rest of the cast are also quite stiff and awkward. Some of the in-folk aren't too bad, but for pretty much everyone else, it's a hammy and not particularly great experience. And finally, the soundtrack. It's all classical compositions, likely to skirt having to pay a composer or any kind of royalty fees. It's all royalty-free compositions and they play the 4 to 5 tracks that they own incessantly, to the point that it quite quickly outstays its welcome and falls into farce. This issue's only made worse by the awful ADR work throughout. I'm pretty convinced that they didn't record any on-set audio because almost everyone has had their voices dubbed in post. And there's no room tone or atmos tracks, so in almost every scene you end up with our characters having overmastered, overproduced vocals with just this void of silence punctuating it. It's horrendous, quite honestly. Die Hard Dracula seems to have had only one release, a DVD released by Alpha Home Entertainment in 2010 as part of their new cinema line. Alpha seemingly specialise in Poverty Row oldies, so I assume the new cinema line was a tentative attempt to break into the lucrative market of low-budget 90s movies. In either case, the quality is totally shonky, the thing's literally a hand-burnt DVD-R with a printed paper label glued onto it. The picture quality is compressed to buggery and looks awful on anything other than a tiny tube TV, and the extra features consist of about 8 minutes of trailers for Alpha's old movies, and that's about it. And since then, it's never been seen again. It's out of print at the time of writing, but there are copies going for cheap on eBay, for now, so I say go and grab one if you think it'll be your kind of party, because I can't guarantee it'll be there in 6 months' time. I still can't get over that contains nudity sticker on this thing. Wild. Die Hard Dracula is a beast unto itself. It doesn't feel like a real film. It feels like someone's pulled this thing from an alternate dimension. If you showed me a trailer for this having not seen it, I'd say it was a parody. And yet the full film actually exists. I ultimately ended up kinda neutral on this one, but leaning towards the positive in all honesty. As a bad movie lover, there's absolutely a lot of strange and bizarre moments in here that really caught my attention, and some genuinely surprising cine that caught me off guard. However, that doesn't forgive the continuous repetition, the dull moments in the second and third act, the dry performances, and the moments where it surpasses enjoyably bad and nosedives into almost unwatchable. If you enjoy your bad movies extra ripe, then absolutely go and check this thing out. It is an enjoyable watch for the most part, and I think it would probably pair up wonderfully with something like Frankie and his pals as a double feature of monster movies where the monsters aren't what you expect. But if you're more into your bigger budgeted schlock, you may want to look elsewhere. Once again, I want to take a moment to thank John so much for putting me onto this thing. While I wasn't totally won over by it, I still found a lot to like, and I'll almost certainly catch it again in future. And thank you once again for your very generous donation. You're a gent and a scholar, and we here at TYTD Towers greatly appreciated your generosity. And with that, we're away. So, take care, keep well, and till next time.